Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to part two of our webinar series on making progress in asset management. This series is brought to you by AMO in partnership with Asset Management Ontario. My name is Erin Orr. I am a program advisor in infrastructure asset management on the CCBF team at AMO. So in the first session, I provided a brief summary of the Canada Community Building Fund and our role in supporting municipal progress and asset management. I also provided an overview of asset management compliance in Ontario, both regarding the CCBF and the OREG 588/17 regulation. So the recording for that session and the slides are now available online at buildingcommunities.ca and amontario.ca. So as mentioned, this is the second session of the webinar series. The first session was on proposed levels of service and performance, and today's session is on risk assessment. So the following two webinars will cover life cycle management and financial strategies and growth. So this four-part series is focused on supporting the continued progress in asset management within the context of Ontario regulatory requirements. Although our main objective is enabling municipalities to advance their asset management programs and effectively manage your infrastructure and be able to plan long-term for your finances. With that, I'm happy to send it off to Jennifer Court from Asset Management Ontario, who will be introducing today's session and panelists.
Thanks, Erin. Hi, I'm Jen Court, Executive Director of Asset Management Ontario. And as Erin said, this is session two of our webinar series. We're focused today on risk assessment, and we have two great speakers for you, Mayuri Bakata and Leanne Brannigan, who I will introduce in more detail in just a moment. First, just a few housekeeping notes. We will have a Q&A at the end of the session after both presentations. You can post your questions in the Q&A box, and we will address those during the Q&A session. Please don't put your questions in the chat. You can interact with each other there, but if you want a question answered, please use the Q&A function. Also, please feel free to introduce yourselves to other attendees in the chat. I know a lot of you are doing that already. Thank you. And then finally, content from today's webinar will be available on our event page. Following the webinar, the presentations will be shared there. So yes, you will get the slides. And when it's ready, a recording of the sessions will be available. So I've posted the link in the chat. I will post it again at the end of the session. With that said, I'm happy to introduce our first presenter, Mayuri Barkata, Senior Advisor with Asset Management Ontario. Mayuri is a manager in corporate asset management at the region of Peel. She is a chartered certified financial professional and holds a certificate and diploma with distinction in asset management through the Institute of Asset Management. Mayuri wears a lot of hats. She is also the accounting manager for AM Ontario. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Mayuri. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Appreciate that. Warm welcome. And let me start sharing my slide. Can everybody see my slide?
Slides are up, but not in full screen yet.
Okay.
There you go. Perfect.
Here we go. So yeah, thanks again, Jennifer. And I'm actually excited to be here with all of you to talk about risk assessment in our asset management plans to prepare for July 1st compliance of OREG 588/17. Oops. Okay, so before we actually dive into risk, I wanted to reiterate what the changes have happened from our previous compliance to this compliance. So the earlier requirements were more focused on your current levels of service. So all the analysis that were required in the asset management plans were based on your current levels of service. Although this one, the compliance for July 1st of 2025, the upcoming one is focusing on a forward-looking approach. So in summary, what this is saying is that this approach is focusing on defining service targets for each asset category, evaluating risk based on their impact on these targets or your proposed levels of service, developing strategies for asset maintenance and replacement to sustain service levels, as well as ensuring a financial plan is in place to fund these needs over the long term. Okay, so quick question. When you hear the word risk, do you immediately think of something bad? I think we all do. Well, with ISO 31000, the definition says risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives, and this could be a positive effect, which would relate to opportunity, or it could be a negative effect, which would be a threat. For assets, we are mainly focused on managing those negative risks, which is the threats. A risk assessment doesn't mean that an event will happen. What it's basically saying that it is a possibility. A risk, as we all know, can't be eliminated, but only managed. When we look at risk management, this is basically a structured approach to identify, assess, and reduce risk to an acceptable level. It basically helps organizations prioritize resources and make those informed decisions. So why does risk management matter? Current funding levels are insufficient to meet our infrastructure needs. The net effect is that the infrastructure is deteriorating rapidly. So risk management basically helps us to understand what your current state of infrastructure is. It helps us in evidence-based decision making. It helps us in prioritizing assets. It also helps us in that investment planning, minimize cost, as well as achieve our objectives. So, in summary, what it's basically saying is that risk management helps us in ensuring the sustainable, reliable municipal services. It helps us identify and manage potential problems before they even happen. It protects your community from financial, operational, and service delivery. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about risk. Risk is often characterized with respect to potential events and their consequences and can be explained as risk being a combination of consequence and likelihood. Consequence is the outcome or the impact of a risk event and has an effect on your objectives, whereas likelihood is the probability of a risk event even happening. Failing asset level of service targets or setting inadequate asset levels of service targets can lead to unacceptable risk. In this picture, there are components of the bridge that are not replaced, which can lead to this person falling and hurting himself. Meeting asset level of service targets lead to acceptable risk. In this picture, all the components of the bridge are intact, although still a chance of this person falling and hurting himself. So in both cases, the consequence is the same, meaning that this person can fall and hurt himself. But what changes is the likelihood. The likelihood of this person falling is much higher when your assets are failing your asset level of service targets, as opposed to when your assets are meeting your level of service targets. Using standardized matrix for assessing both consequence and likelihood for the whole entire portfolio of your organization enables you to compare dissimilar assets. You will be able to compare a treatment plan to an ambulance or even to a social housing building. And just reiterating this again, risk can never be eliminated but managed. And when you operate assets to provide services, there will always be some risk. Okay, so let's take an example here, connecting between risk and levels of service. So let's look at an asset with a condition of poor and a target level of service being fair, which means that we will be replacing this asset when it is no longer in fair condition. So an asset's condition from very good to fair means that this asset is meeting your level of service target and is at target risk. Keeping the asset beyond fair means that the asset is not meeting its level of service target and will start accruing risk beyond the target risk. In this example, our asset is currently in poor condition. So the risk beyond the target risk is called the current risk. So the difference between the current risk and the target risk is the actual asset need. Okay, so let's look at risk management process within asset management. So all the analysis basically starts with the services that the municipality delivers that uses assets in their delivery. Where assets are involved, there is always going to be asset-related risk to those services. Therefore, for all the assets, levels of service are basically established to ensure that there is a measurable way of assessing and measuring how these assets are supporting our services. Risk controls are assessed against those levels of service in order to create that connection between levels of service and risk. A consistent risk framework is then used across the organization that integrates consequence and likelihood matrix to establish and measure the risk to service delivery that the infrastructure presents. Those assets not meeting their level of service targets represents the organizational needs. These variance from the level of service targets generate that excess organizational risk, enabling the setting of the priorities. This information enables senior management and council to make those informed decisions. So let's look at a risk assessment process in a simplified way. Step one for the assessment would be identifying the threats. So let's take an example here of a major transmission main that has a structural failure. So this transmission main ruptures due to its age. So we've identified the threat. Step two would be assessing the consequence to your service delivery. So we identified the threat as that structural failure of the major transmission main. Now, what is the impact going to be to our service delivery because of this failure? Large areas will lose water supply for several hours or even days. Fire hydrants in the area may not work, impacting emergency response. Customers will be experiencing low water pressure or no water at all. Overall, what this is saying that this would be a severe consequence to our service delivery. Step three would be assessing the likelihood of this risk event. So this transmission main was 50 years old and has a history of small leaks. The soil conditions and past inspections suggest that the pipe is at high risk of failure, which means the likelihood assessed for this one would be possible, which means a failure could happen within the next 5 years. So now we've identified what the impact is. We've also identified the likelihood of this risk event. The fourth step is the intuitive validation, and this is a very important step as well. So intuitively validate the risk profile that would be created after these steps with your service areas. So if we look back again, consequences was severe because a failure disrupts water supply for thousands. Likelihood we assessed as high or possible due to the pipe's age and condition. So the risk profile will confirm that this is a high risk asset. Okay, so let's look at the ORIC 58817 compliance towards risk management. So there is basically 5 things that they want us to report on our asset management plan. First, define those proposed levels of service. Secondly, assess risk to service delivery, prioritize those critical assets, develop mitigation strategies, and then integrate risk into your financial planning. So I'll dive a little bit deeper into all these in my next slides. So this approach basically ensures that your municipal infrastructure planning is proactive, sustainable, as well as service-oriented. Okay, so let's look at the first one, defining proposed levels of service. So the question here we want to ask is, what level of service do we want to provide? An example given here is customer level of service, which would be providing reliable, clean drinking water at all times with adequate pressure. Now, to meet that request or requirement from the customer, we have set an asset level of service basically saying no transmission main breaks, which means we would be replacing before it is anticipated to break. The operations and maintenance level of service would be to have that electromagnetic pipe inspections every 5 to 10 years. So we've established our proposed levels of service. Secondly, we need to assess risk to service delivery. Question asked is, what could go wrong? That 50-year-old transmission main is at risk of failing due to corrosion. A failure could actually cause a 24-hour water outage in half of the city. Thirdly, prioritize those critical assets. The question asked here is, which assets are the most important to maintain the service? So ranking assets based on their risk exposure and the impact to service delivery is very important here. In this case, transmission main is critical as it supplies water to 50,000 people, while the other assets like pumps and valves are important, but they have backups. Fourth, develop those mitigation strategies. Again, the question we are asking here is, how can we reduce or manage the risk? So outlining actions to manage risk and sustain that service delivery. So in short term, we could say we would increase monitoring and maintenance of the pipe. On the long term, we're planning for pipe replacement in the next 5 years or having an emergency plan, basically saying that we have alternative supply routes or have water trucks ready. Fifth, integrating risk into financial planning. Question, how do we budget for this risk management? So ensuring funding strategies aligned with maintaining those proposed levels of service, we would say we're allocating 2 million for pipe replacement over 5 years and set aside emergency funds for unexpected issues. So what does this all mean for your municipality? There is proactive planning happening. So you are anticipating and addressing challenges before they even happen. There is informed decisions being made, so you know the risk and trade-offs of each of these choices that you make. There is long-term sustainability, so you are protecting your infrastructure and the financial health. And lastly, safe, reliable services, so you are protecting the health and the safety of your community. Okay, so this is my favorite part, the asset management risk and priority model, which is helping us do the risk assessment. So the Asset Management Ontario's risk assessment and prioritization models use an enterprise risk management approach to assess organizational asset risk and priorities across asset classes, asset levels of service, and individual assets. So if you look at this template here, and these templates are actually online, we have actually videos on how to complete these templates as well. So this is the main template where you add all the information, and this is what you use for your risk assessment. So we have asset classes that are added here. The blue section here is talking about your condition asset levels of service, which is what you add here, and the target as well. The salmon color here, this is talking about your performance asset level of service. So you add your performance asset levels of service here, as well as the targets. The pink section here is the consequences. So this is where we start scoring the consequences. Now, again, these templates are flexible, so this could be your consequence table. So if you already have a consequence table, you already have a likelihood table, you can use those in here. So if you have more than 5, you can add more columns here based on your municipality. The scores are given, you have your consequences. The likelihood of failure on the target is also added in here to give you your target risk, which is a combination of consequence and likelihood. What you see here, this is the current state risk analysis. So you've set your risk targets. What you have here is what you want to set as your current risk. And this is based on your current levels of service, your current inventory. This is where you add, what portion or proportion of your assets are in good, poor, or very poor condition. This will give you your current state risk. What we also have is a 10-year risk here as well. So this will give you a 10-year picture with no funding. So if you don't get funding for the next 10 years, it will show you on your risk profile where or what your risk level is going to be. What I'm not showing here is there's actually a capital plan analysis as well. So once your capital plan is done, you can add that information in here to give you what the risk levels are going to be based on your capital plan. Once this template is completed, which is the main one, we then get a risk profile. So this risk profile is based on either asset class or by conditional performance asset levels of service. So visually, you can see, what levels or risk levels you have for each of these asset class. It helps you prioritize as well. It can also help you prioritize by asset levels of service, whether it be condition or whether it be performance. These are powerful tools that can help you communicate with your council or with your senior management. There is also priority templates in there, as I mentioned earlier, and these metrics or these templates are for giving you priorities based on your asset level of service, whether it be condition or whether it be performance, asset level of service within an asset class as well, or by asset classes. And this is for both core as well as non-core assets. And with that, I would like to say thank you to everybody for your time and your attention, and I will hand this back to Jennifer.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mary. Great presentation and great walkthrough of the models. So with that, our next presenter is Leanne Brannigan. Leanne is the Director of Enterprise Asset Management at Peel Region, with overarching responsibility for 52 billion in diverse infrastructure, ranging from water, linear, through social housing, and everything in between. Leanne was key in establishing the internal relationships necessary for rolling the program out across Peel's diverse services to set organizational priorities and inform evidence-based decision-making, supporting a community for life. Leanne has also leveraged her experience and passion as the founding chair of Asset Management Ontario, the past chair of CNAM, and serves as a member of FCM's MAM Technical Working Group. Thank you so much for being here, Leanne, and I will turn it over to you now.
Thank you. So I'm just going to launch my presentation. If somebody could let me know it's showing up all right.
Looks great.
Okay. I'm following Mayuri, which is always a tough task to do. I'm going to be skipping through. I've made my slides very word heavy, heavier than I normally do, because I wanted to ensure that people had a resource to take away with the content that I would normally be speaking to. As you can see on the title slide, asset management, it's a way of business at the region appeal. Everything that you just saw that Mayuri presented, that's where we started back in 2007. And we've been on a journey since, ever improving and embedding asset management into the way that we do business at Peel. I usually have a nice, funky, fancy roadmap, but I just wanted to give some content here. And there were some things that missing that you couldn't really put in time. What do we have at Peel? It's a way of business. We have an asset management policy. We have had approved levels of service for many years, approved by council, target levels of service. We've embedded asset management into our long-term financial planning strategy. We have an enterprise asset management strategy. We have an asset class strategy library. So asset class strategies for all asset class strategies for all of our assets and infrastructure across Peel, both core and non-core assets. We have an enterprise asset management plan that we issue annually. We have an infrastructure status and outlook report, which is more like a fancy-dancy report card, 3 or 4 pages. We have regular reporting to executive and senior management on the state of the infrastructure needs and investments, investment needs, and updates on key infrastructures, issues, and risks for all of our infrastructure. Regular risk assessments for all asset classes, regular condition assessments for all asset classes, and program asset management plans are in progress at a detailed level, although for every single asset class, we do issue an asset management investment plan. This is all drives or how we are embedded through the long-term financial planning strategy, that if our programs from a state of good repair perspective are in alignment with our recommendations, they don't have to do business cases. We have gone to, at Peel, we have gone to a very much a service-based budgeting perspective, and state of good repair gets funded before anything else. So the asset management challenge, this is going a little bit back to why we started and why we do the way we do everything the way that we do. How do you determine asset priorities? You've got different types of assets across the organization, they're all functioning to different levels of service. They have different criticalities, and they're serving different programs and different levels of service. The goal is to develop a way to prioritize these assets across the organization. And as you can see, Mary presented the foundations of our work, which we have automated, built into a system so that we can regenerate it annually, that does achieve this. Our answer was to utilize risk to do all of that. Mary gave you some wonderful definitions of risk. It's the chance of something happening that will impact the achievement of objectives, positive or negative. We started and used the Australian New Zealand frameworks back in the day, 2009, to kick off, but they're very much, we use them to develop our impact and likelihood measurement tools that are used consistently across the organization, so that we're measuring everything to a consistent organizational risk, and it's all triple bottom line assessment. However, these are consistent with both ISO 31000 and ISO 55000 to this day. So we predated them, but they're still consistent with what it says. The other thing, just like with Asset Management Ontario's model, other risk frameworks could be applied within the whole program that we've developed and could be easily substituted if need be. So what's missing when you're assessing risk? There's gaps in other methodologies to meet all of the needs. There's everybody thinks that the highest risk score is your funding priority. That's not the case. It's not necessarily your highest risk score that's your highest funding priority. Detailed asset risk scores do not roll up to support organizational, cross-asset, and service prioritization. And then so Peel developed the methodology that determines the additional organizational risk that a group of assets impart on the organization. So not just what they are, but how far are they away from their target risk. It indicates where the most cost-effective risk reductions can be made, and it identifies the amount of risk that can be mitigated. The goals of Peel's risk approach. Risk is measured relative to the end services. You should always be measuring risk against services, not against assets. You don't have an asset to be an asset. You have an asset to provide services. An organizational context on the level of risk, check mark. A correlation between level of service needs and risk it imparts on the services, check mark. A dynamic, a comparative basis for prioritization across diverse assets, check mark. And a connection between comparative risk and funding. So you want to have that direct connection between risk, level of service, and the money that's needed to meet it. The core principle behind it, like I said, is we're all measuring everything against service delivery. We're not looking at the highest risk that's the highest priority. We're looking at the highest unacceptable risk. Critical assets are not always the highest priority, even though their risk may be the highest number or the highest bar, the biggest bar on your risk profile, if they're already being managed to an acceptable level. you, as Mary indicated, you cannot eliminate risk. You want to manage it to what's determined to be an acceptable level. And sometimes a high risk will still be acceptable based on what you're able to mitigate or put controls against. The other thing I wanted to show you is just a little bit about how we're structured at the Region Appeal from an administration of asset management standpoint. And I point to the link at the bottom of this is the TC 251 ISO 55000 TC 251 committee that produced a document that's called Managing Assets and Asset Management. And it identifies the difference. And we've pretty much built our framework based on that, even though we did it way before this. The committee came out with that. At the bottom, not necessarily from a hierarchy standpoint, but you have your day-to-day operational activities, your detailed asset management plans, and your specific budget requests and your program activities are short-term, day-to-day, done by our programs. Where we fit in from an enterprise asset management perspective is more on that strategic and longer term tactical side, is looking at how do we support the annual budgets and forecasts? What does our annual infrastructure investment report look like? What does our strategic and long-term investment profile look like, as well as our outlook for our infrastructure? We support, from an organizational standpoint, our enterprise asset management, the rate setting, both from a tax and a utility perspective. We have focused on strategic risk management for asset management. What this does is it focuses on the levels of service, the technical levels of service, risks, and life cycle strategies relating to both the condition and the performance of assets, because the condition tells you the state of good repair and what needs you have for functioning put in place, whereas performance will show you how well they're meeting the service needs. Strategic asset management is done, as I said, at the asset class level of the asset hierarchy. Asset levels of service and the risk profile are identified for each and every single asset class. As you see when we get into risk profiles and we talk about that, the region has over 150 because we've got all of our asset classes represented with a risk profile, unique risk profile. Programs leverage our organizational risk to evaluate their detailed asset risk needs. So they build upon the organizational risk framework to identify those detailed asset and project needs. The advantages of doing it this way: the establishment of a link between assets, current level of service, and risk and current risk. It allows the performance monitoring of assets across the organization, and you can model your level of service. If you can identify your level of service, you can forward model risk. So we model, and because we link level of service and risk, we have our levels of service all have a life cycle related to them. We have just forward modeled risk. The risk gaps can be used to prioritize asset needs across many asset classes, as Mary highlighted. Applying cost to level of service needs enables a direct relationship between risk and dollars, and then dollars can be used to optimize risk reduction, where we best putting our dollars. Performance measures can be established to track improvements in levels of service and risk over time. Boundary risk scores that Mary talked about your boundary, but I'm going to elaborate on a little bit on that in a few minutes. They can be adjusted over time based on programs and the environments in which they operate and change. We always have regulatory changes. We'll have service need changes. This holistic view of the asset infrastructure enables the establishment of risk tolerances and changes to levels of service, because, like I said, we've already proposed we have our levels of service endorsed by council. If we want to change them, we need to go back and show what that risk impact and what the level of service and dollar impact is of making those changes. It's proven beneficial at a portfolio basis as evidence to support program level decision making. Oh, sorry, I thought I had number 8. And then what I wanted to show you a little bit about is Mary talked about her risk profile, and they built a risk profile. We've actually got a little bit of a risk profile on steroids. It's required to establish your risk tolerance or your appetite, your key risk areas, your priorities, and how your options to deal with risks. And I think Mary did an awesome job at walking through all that. It does not necessarily indicate that a risk will occur, but is more of an indicator of the relative criticality and potential vulnerability of those asset classes. And risk profiles are the basis for all of our risk analysis, our organizational prioritization and recommendations that we put forward to council and to support the budget, and Many of the metrics that we report, not only in our State of the Infrastructure Asset report, our Enterprise Asset Management Plan, but also in our asset management investment plans and executive summaries that we issue to support decision making at a senior management level. So how do we do this? And I mean, a lot of this is going to look familiar because Mary and I come from the same background, but I'm showing you how this is how we've put it into play. So basically, we want to set those risk boundaries. And it's a function of your consequence and probability, just like Mary walked you through. So what we do from a risk boundary perspective is we set what's called a residual or target risk. That's where you have your reasonable mitigation in place, assets are meeting their asset level of service targets, and we have minimum asset risk to service. But it's all different. Those targets are all different depending on every single asset class across the organization. Just like Mary said, the little guy walking across the bridge, we've got guardrails and it's pretty stable. Doesn't mean that they can't fall off the bridge. It means we've put everything in place to ensure that they don't. On the other side, we have inherent or maximum, the other boundary risk that we assign. There's no risk mitigation in place. Asset is failing to meet its asset level of service. We're not doing that capital investment or state of good repair investment. We are still doing our normal ops and maintenance because that's all not part of the state of good repair plan, but this represents your maximum asset risk to service delivery. As you can see, there's not a guarantee this guy's going to fall off the bridge, but there's a more opportunity or probability that he could because of the slats missing, no guardrails, etc. Showing you how that full connection looks. And I just showed you that we were assigning a level of service range. We determine our target level of service. We know the failure point of the level of service for that asset or those assets or infrastructure. And then we can, by looking at our infrastructure and our annual updates to our levels of service, we can determine what that current level of service is. Our levels of service are attached to the specific life cycle applicable to that asset class or asset grouping. We also have a risk range. I just talked about how we connect them. We have our residual risk is attached at our target asset levels of service, and our inherent risk or our worst case risk is attached at our failure point level of service. From our current level of service to the target level of service, you can see what that asset level of service gap is that we can measure from a technical standpoint. We gather the data on our technical levels of service. And what we want to be able to do is look at that, what is that additional risk exposure? And we've automated this through our systems. Because we've attached those two boundaries, all we needed to do was figure out how do we determine from our current level of service, what is our current risk? We actually have a system and have done some statistical analysis and have a curve that looks at the connection between those two so that once we determine our current level of service, we can also look at determine our current risk profile for that asset class. What that risk profile looks like, and this is my favorite slide. Mary had one, this is mine. Basically, what we end up with is our risk profile. The outer gray boundary becomes your inherent risk or your worst case risk. It's like a thermometer. We can measure it. That's the highest risk exposure that you can have for that asset class. We then have our target risk we plot on that risk profile, which shows you what our desired risk is after we're implementing or meeting our target level of service. That outer gray then shows you your potential risk range. So how much risk that asset class can be exposed to. Next, what we do is we bring in our data and we can assess and determine what our current risk is. You see right there that we don't have a lot of risk showing because we're maintaining our infrastructure quite well. But what we do is I've got all of the graphics offset here so that you can see the differentials between them. But that risk is driven by the current level of service that comes in. What you can see is that the difference between the end of the bar and where the risk range starts represents our current asset needs. And because we have that attached to our levels of service, we actually have the dollars associated with that risk as well. We then run our system and project what the risk would be in 10 years. So what we run the system saying we're not going to fund anything. What does that risk look like in 10 years? There's a few reasons that we do that. Number one is to show risk sensitivity. Some asset classes will, especially if you're looking at fleet that have a 7 to 10 year life, will be at their maximum risk if we don't fund them within a 10-year period. Some long-lived assets like linear water mains may only accumulate a small amount of risk over a 10-year period. The next thing that we do is we make our recommendation. So what is our recommendation to the program for their risk reduction and the amount that they need to invest in their infrastructure to achieve that? Once again, you can see that I've shown it offset. There's a couple reasons for that. Number one, we may not. There could be a strategic reason that we don't recommend fully achieving the target level of service. And number two, sometimes we don't put costs against performance risks. What you can see is that from the end of our recommendation bar for the asset management investment plan to the end of that 10-year risk, that represents your total risk mitigation for your asset management investment. Too often, people were looking at the end of the current risk bar and measuring that back to where we had our asset management investment plan recommendation and thinking that there was only a small amount of risk or no risk. What you want to look at is through your investments, what risk are you also mitigating? The last thing that we do is if our programs, when they go and actually issue their capital plan, we measure back what their actual investment is against the infrastructure and we put in their capital plan. Like I said before, we have goals at the Region Appeal that they be in alignment with our recommendations, and they often are, but we want to be able to measure the difference and for several reasons. And what you see then between the end of the black bar and the end of the 10-year gray bar is the total risk mitigation for the capital plan. There could be both strategic reasons or alignment reasons with other tiers or other funding opportunities. There could be a lot of reasons why they don't match up with ours, and we always have to justify that in our work go forward. Oops, I went the wrong way. Oh, yes. Okay. So we have to comment on this when we do our variance analysis. When this is what I was saying is that we have to comment on the changes and the differentials when we go forward with our reporting in the fall to support the budget. So what does this do for us? And this looks very familiar too. Basically, Peel's asset management strategy, we have all of our services are included in our strategy. That we have a couple of minor items that are coming in the next little bit, but all of our services are represented. For all of our services, we have levels of service defined, and we have our risk controls assessed against our level of service. And all of our risks have a consequence and likelihood. We're done based on a consequence and likelihood framework. Not meeting levels of service targets represents your asset needs. And then any of our variances from our level of service targets become our priorities. And that informs all of our reporting and decision making that we issue annually to support the annual budget and forecast. This is completely connected throughout the region. We go, and this is just a quick graphic for people to have and take away. We go straight from customer level service through to our asset level service, both condition and performance. Roll that down into pulling in all of the data from across the region and measuring the risk and identifying the needs and the funding requirements. And then we have a whole bunch of funky graphics that come out of that to be able to support decision making and be able to look at the organization from a very high level right down to a granular level. The benefits of this, it's clear and defensible strategic information on state of the infrastructure, asset and service risks, organizational asset needs and priorities, and financing needs. And that's both short-term financing needs as well as long-term. We run our system, just like anybody knows in asset management, you should always be looking at a time frame of your longest lived asset. So we can issue our results based on 10-year, 20-year, 40-year, 100-year. Are the time frames that we typically look at, but we can adjust that for any need that the programs or service areas have, or to meet needs of our program areas. It shifts the discussion from where are we to where do we go. Capital plans are aligning with stated good repair needs. People that have been in the capital planning area for a long time always know it was like an upside down bathroom curb when you saw 10-year capital plans, because people uh, didn't have had to spend the money they already had in the beginning. Then they knew they needed to do a lot of stuff. Then they had no clue what they needed to do later. Now it's at least looking at aligning those capital plans with the actual stated good repair needs. Program experts are driving their detailed plans and managing their assets. That's who should be doing it. You don't want me telling anybody which roof to fix. So we're helping, supporting them in looking at the strategic side and ensuring that they're getting the funding that's needed, and they're determining what the specific works need to be done to support that. It puts the information decisions in the proper hands, one more bullet, and it's all about transparency and objectivity. And Jen was coming on, so you know I'm hitting right on time just about.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Leanne. Just your wrap up warning. The timing was perfect. All right. So thank you to Leanne and Mayuri. I think really great to see how those foundational concepts and the approach that's possible through those like free Excel-based tools is still so similar to the approach that Peel is using, which with obviously much more, complicated and custom systems. So some really, yeah, some good continuity there. So we're gonna go to Q&A. First question, an easy one for Leanne. Are the documents that Leanne mentioned from Region of Peel, that Region of Peel has put together, available for reference for other organizations? So I think you had that list of documents.
Yes. A lot of them. So I will tell you that relationship building is key in asset management. And a lot of the information we've compiled and put into strategies and things that are represented by our programs. We would need people to ask for specific information, and we would need to seek permission from our programs and service areas, as well as some of our reports are used for internal management purposes. And they're not public documents. So we use them to make decisions, and they have a complexity that's not necessarily understandable for the public in the format that we have them. So a lot of it is not available publicly, but however, if you reach out to myself or Mayuri, we can talk about what's available and give examples of things. And that's primarily what we do, is we give examples of how we do things, because we're very happy to share. It's just we have to be cognizant of what is our program information and what they own, and what is of public understanding or built for the public.
Perfect. Yeah. So that was, excuse me, that was from an anonymous attendee. But if you have something specific that you were wondering about, sounds like the answer is, yeah, reach out to Leanne or Mary, and they can share what's available or, yeah, answer some of your specific questions. Okay.
Sorry, Jennifer, just wanted to mention one more thing. If it was just for internal, definitely reach out to us. But for our enterprise asset management plan, as well as the report
Yes.
that goes to council, that is on our external website,
Yes.
on the region's website.
Thanks, Mary.
Yeah, no problem.
And it actually, that's a great point, because it does give a synopsis and an overview of all of our strategies and how we do our work. Because we build that right into our enterprise asset management plan, as well as all of our approved levels of service and things like that. So there is a lot of information there. It's quite substantial.
Perfect. I'm going to go now to a question from Jessica Clapp. Part of the requirements of the asset management policy is public engagement. How does public input fit into the levels of service and risk management model and prioritization?
Great question. And I know there is still work that we need to do on a public engagement side, and we're actually talking to our communications folks about what that looks like going into the future. However, we predated any of the regulatory requirements setting our levels of service, and we did that based on public surveys on service satisfaction. I've seen a lot of surveys that looked at how willingness to pay, and people don't really know what the risks are for services and that they already have meeting their needs. They only look at where they're not meeting their needs, and often it's looking at roads and the potholes in front of their house, as opposed to true service risks. So we set all of our levels of service based on service satisfaction and the technical levels that we were meeting at the time that we put them in place and had them endorsed by council. from a risk perspective, we didn't use public engagement. We used the standards that we have set across the organization for measuring that risk and did full engagement of all of our senior leadership on validating that consequence matrix and what that looks like, and went through our internal risk audit department to ensure that we had a consistent view of looking across all of the infrastructure. So, and then did that connection of the risk framework against the level of service. So the public engagement was done through service satisfaction, not necessarily saying, what do you think we should, what level of PCI should we maintain our roads to, or WRC to our pipes? Like, I mean, it becomes a difficult measure, but we do have customer levels of service assigned against our technical levels of service that you could take a look at and that's actually in our enterprise asset management plan too.
Publicly available.
Publicly available.
Mary, anything you want to add to that?
No, I think she covered it. Thanks.
Excellent.
Phew.
Okay. Um, Another one for Leanne. This is from Amber Dewar.
Yeah.
Leanne, do you have software that you're using for these risk assessments, or was it all created in-house?
No software. It's all done in Excel. We used our own framework and our own. So the risk assessments are and the risk profiles are created in Excel. However, when we collect all of our data, we have a system that evaluates all of the levels of service because we have so much infrastructure. Like I said, $52 billion worth of infrastructure. I can't even tell you the number of data records that is. So we have a system that we've created to measure that levels of service to find out where we are in our target level of service range and then connect that back to our risk, which we do the risk profile outside because we have to do when you set those boundary risk points, both your target risk and your inherent risk, you have to do that from outside of the system. That's not something that's going to be within the system. It's determining where you fall in that range that our system does for us.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that answers that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, Mary, you spoke about this in your presentation, but I'll just highlight again, the approach is really similar to the approach that we use in the free, available to you risk assessment templates. It's integrated with the levels of service and then the financial strategies, life cycle costing templates that we make available. And as Troy highlighted in our first session, we do also have a simplified version of that levels of service framework that we're going to be launching on April 6th. Cannot hang on to the date of that last session. So stay tuned for that. But the risk assessment template, yeah, it's very integrated with those other pieces and produces similar results. Mayor, did you want to expand on that a little bit or?
No, we did talk about risk assessment, and I think in the next webinar, we will talk about life cycle management. So we do have templates for that as well. So that connects
They all
everything.
flow
Yes.
together. So
Yeah,
Yes.
and that's what our system does. Because someone asked, "What is the system called?" And it's an in-house built system because it actually attaches our levels of service to all of our life cycles, and there are many. We have about 4 different types of life cycles, but there's a unique life cycle for every asset class, and then attaches it to risk and drives the funding. So that's an internal in-house built system. It's actually at end of life. It's 13 years old and it's dying, and we're looking to replace, but we know that there's nothing in the market that does what our system does. So we have our architects working on that for us.
excellent. Okay, 2 more questions. One of them, Trevor Woodkey says, "Are Peel staff available for hire to prepare an AMP for other municipalities?" Smiley face.
Okay, that's funny because we used to work with Trevor at Peel, so he would love it if we did that for him. Yeah, no, sorry.
Unfortunately, no, but again, a lot of those similar approaches in the tools available through Asset Management Ontario. So anybody can feel free to reach out for support.
Actually, Trevor Woodkey has used those templates.
Perfect. Okay, one final question in the chat, and we do have time to, or sorry, in the Q&A, and we do have time to take it. So from Reese Chung, how did you present internal corporate supporting services such as fleet, IT, or facilities?
Great question. So we have associated the facilities with the service they deliver. So, because it would be a unique risk profile, not just for facilities, but a long-term care center is going to have a different risk profile than a pumping station, than a paramedic station. So they are represented under the service that they're supporting. We have fleet and IT are supporting a corporate service. But what we do is we have them under the service of internal service under our reporting. But what they do is we have them isolated because where their budget funding is coming from, and that's how we break them out. So we did, and we represent them in the same way that we showed you with the risk profile, determining what their levels of service is, assigning the life cycle, and connecting that with the risk profile, and it works in the same way, generating the funding, generating the risk metrics. In the same way, it's just from a positioning standpoint in the reporting, we wouldn't have them necessarily under an external service. We would have them under an internal service, and we actually call them our internal fleet is from our operations support group.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay. Um, we did it. We answered all of the questions in the Q&A. Great timing. Thank you so much. A final thanks to both of our presenters today. Lots of thanks in the chat as well. So really great job. And thank you to all of our attendees. We really appreciate you being here with us. Our next session is Thursday, March 27th. As Mary mentioned, and as Erin mentioned off the top, we're focusing on lifecycle management and financial strategies. If you're not already registered, you can do so from the event page that I shared. I'll paste that link one more time before we break. And that is the same link that I shared where the presentations from today, as well as the recording, will be made available shortly. Just give us a little bit of time to process everything and get it up. So if you're looking for additional support or access to those Excel-based tools, links in the chat or our contact information and AMO's contact information is on the screen in front of you. Thanks again, and I hope to see you all next week.